The wind slapped against the cabin walls like an old dog with a bone, each gust bending the boards. The cowboy sat at the kitchen table, eyes narrowed, studying the woman as she moved about the room. She was quicker tonight, hands jittering as she set the tin plates down. There was something off about her, something in the way her eyes avoided him that hadn't been there before. He'd seen her nervous, sure, but this was different, like something inside her was turning over, just about to break loose. He didn't ask. He'd learned not to ask. Silence sat heavy between them. He watched her hands, the way they shook just enough to make the silverware clink. "Storm's getting closer," he said, breaking the silence. She didn't respond at first, just kept moving. She always moved, always cleaning, always busying herself with something. Maybe she thought it made him forget the things she wouldn't say. She muttered, voice flat. He kept his eyes on her, letting the silence stretch out. She finally looked up, just for a moment, but it was enough. There it was again, something hidden behind her eyes, fear, guilt. He didn't know, but he could feel it clawing at her. The air felt thick, like the storm itself was trying to come inside. He didn't wait for her to speak. He didn't need her to. He pushed the plate aside, stood up. "Where's the bucket?" She stopped, turned to him with a sharpness in her gaze, something dangerous that wasn't there before. "What?" "The bucket. I need water." Her mouth opened, but nothing came out at first. Then she nodded, walked to the door without saying a word. The wind howled louder, the cabin creaking with every gust. He followed her outside, stood in the doorway as she made her way to the well. The ground was slick with rain, mud sloshing under her boots, but she didn't care. Her back was to him as she leaned over the well, the rope creaking as it slid through the pulley. He didn't watch her struggle, just let his eyes wander to the horizon. The storm was coming, just like it always did. But there was something in her movements now, something frantic. The bucket clinked against the stone, and she hauled it up with a strength that seemed out of place for someone so small. He wasn't sure if it was the wind or if she was shaking. He didn't ask. She didn't offer any more than what she always did. She handed him the bucket, her hands cold and tight around the handle. "There's a storm coming," she said, but it wasn't like before. The words didn't sit right. They weren't a warning, but a statement, and it made him uneasy. He took the bucket from her hands, fingers brushing hers for a second. He felt it then. The tremor in her skin, the unsteady breath, something was wrong. She was hiding something. The door slammed shut behind them as they stepped back into the cabin. The fire in the stove flickered weakly, casting shadows on the walls. She was already at the table, wiping it down again, even though there was nothing on it. Her hands were too quick, too precise, like she needed something to do, something to occupy her mind. But it wasn't working. The storm was close now, the wind shaking the shutters, rattling the bones of the house. "Have you ever thought about leaving?" The words came out of nowhere. The cowboy wasn't sure why he said them. It wasn't like him to push. She froze, hands still on the rag. "Leaving?" Her voice was small, but the pause told him everything. She wasn't sure how to answer. "You know, somewhere else. Get out of here." "Why would I leave?" Her tone was too calm, too practiced. "Hell, I don't know. Maybe because you don't have to keep hiding out here." The words were too harsh, and he saw it flicker. Something dark, something that made her flinch before she caught herself. She didn't meet his eyes. "I'm not hiding," she said, low, almost too low for him to hear. But he did. And it was enough. He let her have her silence then, watched her scrub the same spot on the table for a little longer than necessary. The wind howled outside, and the storm crept closer. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming, something buried deep in this place. Maybe it wasn't just the storm. He could feel it, thick in the air like smoke, a presence just on the other side of the door. And she knew it. She was the one holding it in. "I didn't mean anything by it," he said, but it felt wrong, like the words had no place here. She didn't answer. She never did when he said things like that. Instead, she took the bucket from his hand, set it down on the floor, and turned away to hang up her coat. The storm slammed into the cabin with a deafening roar, rattling the windows. The wind didn't care. The house didn't care. Neither did she. But he did. "You all right?" he asked, taking a slow step toward her. She didn't answer at first. Then she turned back to him, her eyes wide. "I'm fine," she said, her voice low, almost a whisper. but he could see the way her mouth trembled, the way her shoulders hunched under the weight of something she wouldn't say. He knew better than to press, but the silence between them was heavier than the storm outside. It pulled at him, gnawed at him. She turned back to the fire, face half lit by the flames. The shadows danced across her features, but he couldn't get a read on her anymore. "You don't have to stay," he said. "Not if you don't want to." She didn't move. She didn't even blink. He should have left it at that. But the words spilled out anyway. "You know that, right?" She nodded slowly, the motion stiff. She didn't look at him when she answered. "I know." The fire crackled. The storm raged on. The cowboy sat at the table, the rough-hewn wood beneath his palms slick from the sweat of the day. He watched her as she moved, quick and deliberate, setting the plate in front of him without a word. She didn't speak much anymore, but tonight her silence was heavier than usual. The stew was thick, steam rising from the bowl, but the smell didn't reach him. He wasn't hungry. He couldn't be, not with the way her eyes darted to the door, then to the stove, then back again. Like something, or someone, was just beyond the threshold, waiting. Her hands were shaking as she set the bread down, fingers stiff and cold, but she didn't acknowledge it. He noticed. He always noticed. He wasn't sure if it was the storm outside or the tension in the air that made it so damn hard to breathe, but there was something in the way she moved, in the way her lips barely parted as she spoke. "You want salt?" she asked, her voice too high, too fast. He didn't answer at first, just stared at the food like it was the last meal he'd ever see. She stood over him, waiting, eyes flickering to the door once again. "Are you waiting for someone?" The question slipped out before he could stop it. Her eyes locked onto his then, sharp and quick, but it didn't last. She turned away, walking back to the stove, not answering. She didn't have to. He already knew the answer. There was someone out there, someone she was waiting for, and it wasn't him. She'd been like this for days now, distant, as if she was always just a little too far away. He pushed the plate aside, scraping the fork across the surface, making a sound too loud in the quiet of the room. "You don't have to wait for them, you know," he said, leaning back in his chair. "You could just leave." He said it like it didn't matter, like it was no more than an idea. But she froze, just for a moment. Her hand hovered over the stove, fingers twitching as if she couldn't decide whether to turn the heat up or not. "Leave," she whispered, like she hadn't heard the word in years. "Where would I go?" He didn't answer right away. He wasn't sure. He wasn't sure about anything anymore, least of all her. But she wasn't looking at him. Her eyes were glued to the window, watching the shadows stretch in the fading light. She hadn't answered his question. She wouldn't. He could feel it, thick as the stew sitting untouched before him. She wasn't going anywhere, not unless someone made her. The wind howled louder outside, the storm coming on fast. The shutters rattled, and he could feel the house tremble, like it was holding its breath. He cleared his throat, stood up, and grabbed the plate. She looked up then, her gaze catching him. There was something in her eyes, a flicker of fear or maybe guilt, but it was gone before he could be sure. "You should eat," she said, her voice low. But she didn't reach for the food. She didn't even offer to refill his glass. She was standing too still, like a clock wound too tight, waiting for the moment it would snap. He didn't know why, but it struck him then. She wasn't afraid of the storm outside. She was afraid of whatever was in here with them. And it wasn't him. She wasn't afraid of him. He turned back to the window, the wind pushing the trees so hard they seemed to lean into the night, pressing against the house like it wanted to. She didn't move. She never moved when the wind got like this, not unless she had to. But tonight, she was watching it like it had a face, like the wind itself was a memory, something from the past she couldn't escape. He felt the weight of her silence, felt it stretch between them like a tightrope, thin and fraying. It made the air taste heavy like dust and old secrets. The meal went cold between them. He could feel it now, the way the space had closed in on him, how every movement she made felt like a door closing. He should have left. He should have gotten up, grabbed his coat, and gone out into the night where the storm would drown out the tension. But he didn't, and neither did she. She was still standing by the stove, watching him out of the corner of her eye. The seconds felt like hours, each one dragging them further apart. The meal sat untouched between them, a barrier they couldn't cross. Finally, he broke the silence. "I don't need this," he said, pushing the plate away. She didn't say anything. She didn't move. She just stared at the stove like she was waiting for the flames to give her an answer. He shook his head, grabbed his hat from the hook by the door, and headed outside without another word. The wind hit him like a slap, cold and biting. He didn't care. He just needed to move, needed to feel something other than the tension in that cabin. The storm was here now, the sky flashing with light, and for a moment it felt like everything was coming undone. He couldn't put his finger on it, not yet, but he knew she was hiding something, and he knew it was more than just fear of the storm. It was something deeper, something she wasn't ready to face. He paused outside the door for a moment, feeling the weight of the night. Then he turned and walked toward the barn. The wind carried the sound of the door creaking behind him, but he didn't look back. Inside, she was still there, and the meal was still waiting. And he didn't know why, but somehow he knew it wouldn't be the last time. The wind had died down a bit, but the storm still simmered in the distance, making the air thick and heavy. The cowboy stepped out onto the porch, eyes scanning the barnyard. Her footprints were fresh in the mud, the only sign she had passed through. She'd left the cabin in a hurry, and he'd seen it, the way her shoulders tensed when she didn't think he was looking. He wasn't sure what she was up to, but he was damn sure she wasn't being honest with him. The silence between them had been like a noose, tightening with every word she didn't say. He stepped off the porch, boots sinking slightly into the soft earth, and followed the tracks. The barn loomed. In the distance, its outline barely visible against the darkening sky. He didn't rush. He didn't need to. But something pulled at him, something that gnawed at his gut like an itch he couldn't scratch. He walked to the barn slowly, like he was already hearing the answers in his head, but they were slipping just out of reach. The tracks led him straight to the door, and for a second, he hesitated. The barn was old, the wood sagging under years of neglect. He could feel it, something in the air, something thick and heavy like the walls were about to spill over with secrets. He pushed the door open, the creaking sound sharp in the stillness. The smell of hay, dust, and animal remains hit him like a wall. He stepped inside. The barn was dark, shadows creeping across the corners like something alive. The boards groaned underfoot as if they had stories to tell, but they kept them locked up tight. He scanned the space, eyes darting from the old tool racks to the empty stalls. No sign of her. Not yet. The floor was cracked, the walls lined with old barrels and broken crates. The door slammed behind him, and he flinched. The air felt colder inside, a chill that cut through his coat. He could see her now, standing in the far corner, just inside the shadow of the loft. She didn't turn when he approached, didn't flinch, just stood there like a ghost waiting for the world to leave her alone. "I told you I'd be out here," she said, her voice low, distant. He didn't reply. He couldn't. Her presence in the barn was like the last breath before a storm hit, heavy, suffocating. He stepped closer, his boots kicking up dust that danced in the faint light spilling through the cracks. "What are you hiding?" The words came out harsh, but they were true. She wasn't supposed to be here, not like this. Nothing. She shifted her weight from one foot to the other, avoiding his eyes, but he saw it. He saw how her hands trembled just enough to make the air around her vibrate. "Are you sure about that?" He took another step toward her, not stopping, not giving her room to breathe. She swallowed, her throat working like she was choking on something she couldn't say. He was close enough now to see the fear in her eyes. It was there, raw and real. And that was when he knew. Whatever she was hiding, it was bigger than him, bigger than the barn. She wasn't just afraid of him, she was afraid of something else, something he couldn't see. "I'm not doing this with you," she muttered, turning her back to him. She walked deeper into the barn, a low, strangled noise escaping her throat as if she was fighting to keep the weight of it all down. He followed, his heart pounding harder in his chest with every step. The barn creaked under his feet, the old wood whispering like it was trying to tell him something, but the words were too faint. He could feel it. Whatever she was trying to hide was locked up in this place. Maybe it always has. Been. He grabbed her arm when she turned to leave, his grip firm but not cruel. She flinched at the contact, but she didn't pull away. "What is it?" he asked, his voice quieter now, controlled. She didn't answer. She couldn't. But the way her eyes avoided his told him everything he needed to know. It was there, hidden in the shadows, a secret too dark for daylight. She tugged her arm free, her face pale. "You need to go," she said, the words coming out in a whisper, "before you find something you don't want to see." He didn't move, didn't flinch. He stared at her like he could burn the truth out of her just by looking. "Then show me," he said, his voice low. "Show me what you're hiding." She shook her head, stepping back, retreating into the corner where the shadows swallowed her whole. He didn't follow her. He didn't need to. The truth was here, in this barn, in the creaking of the old walls and the weight of the air pressing down on them. He could feel it now, the heavy burden she'd been carrying. And he knew, deep down, that the storm had nothing to do with the weather. The storm was here, inside the barn, inside her. She finally spoke again, her voice cracking under the weight of her own secrets. "You're not going to like it." "Doesn't matter," he said, not looking away. "I'm already here." She closed her eyes, took a shaky breath, then nodded. She stepped toward the back of the barn, near the farthest corner where the light couldn't reach. He followed. She crouched, then pulled at a loose board in the floor, revealing something underneath. The space was cramped, the air thick and damp. He crouched beside her, eyes scanning the small hole she had opened, and then he saw it. A box, old and battered, covered in dust and dirt. He reached for it without thinking. She grabbed his arm before he could lift it. "Don't," she said, her voice trembling. But it was too late. The lid came off with a sharp crack. Inside there were papers, letters, tied with a worn piece of twine. He pulled one out, the ink faded but legible. She let out a low, desperate sound, but he didn't stop. He read the words and his stomach turned. He finally understood. Whatever she was hiding, it wasn't just hers to carry. It was a legacy, a chain she couldn't escape. He looked at her, the truth sinking in like lead. "You can't outrun this," he said quietly. She didn't answer. She didn't have to. The barn creaked again, the old wood sighing as if it had finally let go of its secrets. And for the first time, he understood. The storm wasn't just outside. It was here, in the heart of this place, buried deep. The barn door creaked open, and the cowboy stepped inside. The air was thick with the smell of hay and dust, and for a moment it felt like he was back in time, standing in a place that had never seen a day of peace. He could hear her before he saw her. Her footsteps were soft, almost too soft, but there was something about the way she moved, like she was trying to hide. He didn't need to ask why she was here. He knew. It wasn't the first time she'd come to this place, but tonight was different. There was something heavy in the air, a weight that pressed against him with each step he took. He found her in the back corner, hunched over, her back to him. She didn't hear him approach, but he didn't make a sound. He didn't want to startle her. She was already on edge, and he knew better than to push her too far. "You've got a lot of explaining to do," he said, his voice low. She froze. She hadn't expected him to speak. Her hands, which had been busy at her side, trembled for a moment before she stilled them. He could see the tension in her shoulders, the way she was holding herself together, like any wrong move would make everything unravel. "It's not what you think," she muttered, still facing away from him. Her voice was strained, like she was trying to convince herself as much as him. "No?" He took another step forward, careful not to make any sudden moves. "Then what is it exactly?" She didn't answer right away. Instead, there was a shift in the air, like the barn itself was holding its breath. And then it came. The faintest sound, so soft that he almost didn't hear it. A cry. A baby's cry. His heart skipped, and he took another step, his boots sinking slightly into the floor. The cry came again, muffled, like it was trying to escape but couldn't. He paused, his eyes locked on her back, waiting for her to turn around. "What the hell is that?" he asked, his voice quieter now. She turned quickly, a flash of panic crossing her face. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. Her eyes, wide with fear, told him everything he needed to know. It was a baby. There was a baby in this barn. He stepped toward her, but she moved faster, blocking his way. "You can't be here," she whispered urgently, her eyes flicking toward the hayloft. "You need to leave. Now." He didn't move. "What's going on, huh?" he demanded, his tone hardening. "Where's this kid come from?" She swallowed but didn't speak. The baby's cry cut through the air again, louder this time. He could feel the weight of it, the desperation in the sound. She looked at him like she was caught between two choices, neither of them good. I'm not leaving until you tell me what this is, he said, his voice unyielding. She stepped aside then, just enough to let him pass. He didn't wait for her to tell him twice. He moved into the corner, toward the hayloft where the crying seemed to be coming from. The small cry grew louder as he got closer, until it was all he could hear. The sound was breaking through the quiet of the barn, piercing the thick air with a haunting urgency. There, lying in a bed of hay, was a small bundle, wrapped tightly in an old blanket. He froze. For a second, he didn't know what to do. The baby's eyes were closed, but it was still alive, still crying, small and fragile and helpless. He knelt down beside it, reaching for the bundle, but she was already there. Her hand shot out, grabbing his wrist. "Don't!" The word was barely more than a breath, but it stopped him. He looked up at her, the panic in her eyes reflecting his own fear. "Please," she said, her voice breaking. "You don't understand." "Understand what?" He pulled his wrist free, but she didn't let go of him. She held on tight, like she was trying to keep him from seeing something he wasn't supposed to. "I didn't want this," she whispered. "I didn't want any of this." She shook her head, tears welling in her eyes. "Then why?" He couldn't stop the words from coming. "Why is it here? Why now?" She didn't answer, just shook her head again, like she couldn't bear to tell him. The baby's cries were louder now, more desperate, but she didn't move. He stepped back slowly, his mind racing. "What happened?" he asked, more gently this time. She didn't say anything for a long moment. Then her shoulders slumped, and she spoke, barely above a whisper. "It's not mine," she said. "It's not mine, but I couldn't leave it. I couldn't let them have it." The air between them thickened again. "Who?" he asked, the word catching in his throat. She didn't answer, just wiped her eyes and turned away. He looked back at the baby, the fragile little thing still squirming in its blanket, the cries cutting through the silence like a blade. She looked at him one last time, her eyes full of sorrow, full of something too heavy for words. "Please," she said, "you need to leave now, please, before they come for it." The words hung in the air, thick and impossible, but he didn't need any more. He understood now. He didn't want to, but he did. He stood up slowly, turning away from the baby, but he didn't look back at her. He could still hear it, the baby's cries, and it would stay with him. He walked out of the barn, the door creaking behind him. The wind had picked up again, the storm looming, but he couldn't shake the feeling that the worst of it was still inside. He didn't wait for her to stop him this time. She moved to block his way, but he pushed past her, his hand brushing against her arm as he stepped into the barn. The door creaked loudly behind him, but the sound didn't seem to matter now. The air inside was thick, stale, and full of something he couldn't name. She stood in the doorway, watching, but he didn't care. His eyes were already searching the barn, scanning the shadows, looking for the source of the sound. And then he saw it. The baby. It was lying there in the hay, wrapped in a blanket so old and threadbare it barely held together. The small form barely moved, just a faint rise and fall of its chest. His heart caught in his throat as he stared at it, his feet frozen to the floor. The world seemed to stop. He couldn't move, couldn't speak. The baby's fragile little body, so small and vulnerable, was enough to fill the entire room. He swallowed, but the dryness in his throat made it impossible. The baby's cries had stopped. It was so quiet now, the only sound was the rustling of the hay beneath his boots. She was behind him now, watching him carefully, her breathing shallow and quick. He could feel her presence, like a shadow, stretching across the barn, but he couldn't turn around. His eyes were locked on the baby. "What the hell is this?" The words barely left his lips, but they hung in the air like smoke. She didn't answer. She couldn't. Her wide eyes were fixed on the baby, too, and he could see the fear in her face, fear that wasn't just for herself. He took a step forward, his boots crunching in the hay. He reached out, almost without thinking, and touched the blanket. It was cold, damp. He could feel the weight of it. "You said it wasn't yours," he said, his voice low. She nodded but didn't speak. He looked at her finally, really looked at her, and saw something he hadn't before, something darker. "Then why?" he asked. "Why bring it here?" She took a slow step back, her hand rising to her mouth, biting down hard on her lip. She was shaking. She couldn't meet his eyes. "I couldn't leave it," she said, the words coming out in a whisper. "I couldn't let them take it." "Who?" he asked. The question hung between them, waiting for an answer. She didn't respond. She only stepped closer to the baby, her hands trembling as she reached for it. Her fingers brushed the blanket, but she didn't pick it up. She couldn't. The weight of what she was carrying, of what she had kept hidden, seemed to be too much. He took another step forward, his voice harder now, demanding, "Who's coming for it?" Her eyes flicked up to his, and for a moment he thought she might break. But then she turned away, walking towards the far corner of the barn, her back to him. She didn't answer, and he didn't expect her to. "You can't keep it here," he said, his voice sharp. "You have to tell me what's going on, why this is happening." She didn't stop. She just stared at the wall, her body tense. The barn was too quiet now, the shadows stretching like fingers from every corner, creeping closer to them. The weight of the silence grew until it was unbearable. "You're not the only one with secrets," she finally said, her voice tight with restraint. "I don't have a choice." "Yes, you do," he said, stepping closer, his boots crunching louder in the stillness. "You always have a choice." Her hand shot out, and for a second he thought she was going to push him away, but instead she grabbed a rusty shovel from the corner and held it in front of her like a shield. "Get out," she whispered, her voice strained. He didn't move. "Tell me," he said, his voice lower now, "what's really going on?" But she didn't speak. She only lowered the shovel, her hands shaking so violently that he could see the weapon trembling. He could see the rawness of her, the brokenness in her, and for a brief moment, it felt like everything in the barn, the walls, the hay, the baby, was collapsing around them. He could feel the fear pressing down on him, the fear of something bigger than the both of them. She let out a breath, deep and shaky, her voice barely a whisper when she finally spoke. "They'll come for it," she said, almost pleading. "They'll take it from me, and they'll make sure I never see it again." "Who?" he demanded again. "Who's going to take it?" She swallowed hard, stepping back towards the baby, her eyes still locked on the small form. Her voice was barely audible when she spoke again. "The sheriff," she said. "He's the one who's been looking for it." The words hit him like a blow to the chest. His mind raced, but his body remained still. The sheriff? He was supposed to be the law, the one who kept order. And yet here he was, part of a story that was darker than he had imagined. She wasn't just hiding a child. She was hiding from a man with power, a man who could make her life hell. And he hadn't known. "You've been running from him?" he asked, his voice barely more than a murmur. She nodded, her hand reaching for the baby again, but this time she picked it up. The small body fit into her arms, and for a moment she looked almost peaceful, like the storm inside her had finally calmed. "I can't let him have it," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I can't." He didn't know what to say. He didn't know how to make this right. But he knew one thing for sure. Whatever had brought them here, whatever had led him into this barn, wasn't going to let either of them walk out the same. The barn felt smaller now, darker, as if the shadows were closing in. He knew it, and so did she. They were trapped. The barn was suffocating. The walls seemed to close in with each passing second. The baby, quiet now, lay in her arms, its fragile form still and small. The woman didn't move, didn't blink. She stood in the corner, her back pressed against the rough wood, her eyes locked on him as if daring him to step closer. He didn't need to ask. He already knew. There was a story buried here, something so deep that even the barn seemed to hold its breath in anticipation. "Where did it come from?" he asked again, this time his voice harder, more insistent. The air between them was thick, stretched so tight it was almost unbearable. She didn't answer, just stood there, her body tense, her eyes wide and unblinking. He could feel the weight of her silence, pressing down like an unspoken confession. She was cornered now, and she knew it. He could see it in her eyes, the quiet admission of guilt, the secrets she couldn't let go of. But she wouldn't speak. She didn't want to. "Damn it, tell me," he said, stepping closer. His boots crunched against the hay, the sound loud in the silence. The baby shifted in her arms, a faint murmur escaping its lips, but she didn't react. Her face remained frozen, her eyes dark, refusing to meet his gaze. He could see the fear in her, but it wasn't just fear of him. It was something deeper, something she was hiding, something she couldn't put into words. "I need to know," he said, his voice softer now, almost pleading. "This is bigger than both of us." Still, she didn't speak. She just stood there, clutching the baby to her chest, her body rigid, as if every part of her was bracing for something, for him to leave, for him to give up. But he wouldn't. He couldn't. "You can't keep running," he said, his voice low. "Not forever." Her eyes flicked to the door behind him like she was measuring the distance. He followed her gaze and then turned back to her. She wasn't thinking about escape. Not yet. But the thought was there, buried under layers of silence. "You're not telling me everything," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "Why?" The question hung between them, hanging like the dust in the air, too heavy to ignore. Her jaw clenched, and for a second he thought she might crack, that she might finally give him the answers he was searching for. But she didn't. She only looked at him, her eyes dark, her expression unreadable. The silence stretched on, thick and suffocating. It felt like the barn itself was waiting for something to break. "I'm not asking for your pity," she said, finally speaking, but her voice was barely above a whisper. "I'm not asking for your forgiveness." The words stung, but they weren't meant for him. She wasn't talking to him anymore. She was talking to herself, trying to make sense of something that had long been lost. "Then what are you asking for?" he said, stepping even closer. His voice was sharp now, harder. "What do you want me to do? Just walk away?" She didn't answer, but her eyes flickered for a split second, like she was wondering the same thing. He saw it in the way she held the baby, the way her hands trembled around its tiny body. She wasn't just protecting the child, she was protecting herself, her past, her choices, the things she had done to get here. "I can't help you if you don't tell me," he said, frustration building in his chest. "I can't fix this if you won't talk to me." She flinched at the words, her breath catching for just a moment. It was the first time she had shown any sign of breaking. She closed her eyes, as if the weight of the world had settled on her shoulders. The baby shifted again, its soft cry breaking the silence, but she didn't move to comfort it. She was too far gone in her own mind, too trapped in whatever was weighing her down. "I never meant for it to go this far," she finally said, her voice so quiet it was barely audible, but the words hit him like a blow. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice hard, demanding. She looked at him then, her eyes wide and filled with something that looked like regret, but also fear. Fear of what would happen if the truth came out. "I didn't know where else to go," she whispered. "I didn't have a choice." He was close enough now to see the sheen of tears in her eyes, but she didn't let them fall. She wasn't going to cry, not in front of him, not now. "You didn't have a choice?" he repeated, stepping back slightly, his mind racing. "You're telling me you had no other option but to hide a baby here?" She nodded, but the motion was slow, almost reluctant. No one could know, no one could find out. He stared at her, disbelief creeping into his chest. Why? Why is it so important that no one knows? The baby let out another faint cry, and she finally moved, rocking it gently in her arms, but her eyes never left him. "Because if they did," she said, her voice barely more than a breath, "it would destroy everything, everything I've worked for, everything I've built." He could see the weight of her words in her eyes, the way they haunted her. The truth was buried deep inside her, and she wasn't ready to let it out. But he knew now. He understood. Whatever was hidden in this barn, whatever this baby represented, it was something that would break them both. And the more he pushed, the harder it would be to keep it together. He stepped back, feeling the weight of the silence between them. He didn't know what else to say. He didn't know how to fix this, how to help her. But he knew one thing. The truth would come out. It always did. And when it did, there would be no turning back. The silence stretched between them like a wound that wouldn't heal. The barn was colder now, the wind outside kicking up dust that slipped through the cracks in the walls. She stood by the baby, rocking it gently, but her eyes were far away. He could see the distance in her, the way she pulled inward, as though trying to hold herself together. He couldn't just stand there anymore. He couldn't leave her with this weight, with these secrets that threatened to swallow her whole. "You're not telling me everything," he said, his voice quieter now, trying to break through the thick quiet that surrounded her. She didn't answer, just rocked the baby slowly, her gaze fixed on the floor. "What happened to you?" he asked, more softly this time, his voice carrying the weight of his concern. "What happened before this?" She didn't respond at first, and for a moment he thought she wouldn't. But then her shoulders slumped and she sighed, a deep aching sound that seemed to come from somewhere deep inside her. She looked up at him, her eyes heavy with something she wasn't ready to share. "It wasn't always like this," she said, her voice hoarse. "I wasn't always here." The words were so simple, but they carried the weight of years, of choices she couldn't take back. He stepped closer, but she didn't move, didn't flinch. She wasn't afraid of him anymore. "Tell me," he said, his voice gentle now, like he was trying to coax a story from her that she wasn't sure she wanted to tell. She took a slow breath, her hands trembling slightly as she held the baby. "I came from a small town," she started, her voice quiet but steady. "A place where everyone knows everything about everyone else. They talk and they judge and they don't let you forget who you are, who your family is." She paused, her eyes flickering briefly to the baby in her arms as though it was a reminder of something. "My father was a sheriff," she said, the words slipping out like they were more than just a fact. "He wasn't like the other men in town. He didn't take bribes. He didn't look the other way. He thought he could change things." The words caught in her throat and she looked away, her eyes clouded with memories. "But they didn't want change," she continued, her voice dropping to a whisper. "They wanted things to stay the same. They didn't want him interfering, questioning them." She shifted uncomfortably, the weight of the past pressing down on her shoulders. "One night he just disappeared. Gone. No one knows where he went. Some people say he left town, others say he was taken, but no one ever found him." She wiped her eyes quickly, as if brushing away the weight of the memory. "I couldn't just wait for answers. I had to leave, too. I couldn't stay in a town that was so full of lies and secrets." The cowboy stood there, letting her words sink in, trying to understand what she was saying. But the more she spoke, the more the pieces of the puzzle shifted, revealing a story far darker than he had imagined. "What does that have to do with this?" he asked quietly, nodding toward the baby in her arms. She didn't answer right away, her eyes flickering down to the child. She seemed to lose herself for a moment, her thoughts drifting. "I made a promise," she said finally, her voice trembling, "to my father. I promised him I'd protect the ones who couldn't protect themselves." She swallowed hard, and the words seemed to choke her as they left her mouth. "I couldn't keep my promise. Not then. But I've got a second chance now." She looked at him then, really looked at him, her eyes brimming with a quiet desperation. "This baby," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "is the last piece of the puzzle. The one thing I couldn't save." Her words hung in the air, thick with sorrow. The baby shifted in her arms again, a soft whimper escaping it, but she didn't react. Her face was set in a hard mask of regret, a mask she'd worn for too long. "I don't understand," the cowboy said, his voice full of confusion. "What do you mean?" She closed her eyes for a moment, as if she was trying to gather the strength to finish her story. When she spoke again, her voice was raw, vulnerable. "The baby's not just a baby," she said. "It's the reason my father was taken, the reason he disappeared. It's all connected." The cowboy stood still, processing the weight of her words. "What do you mean it's connected?" he asked, the questions coming faster now, his mind spinning. She looked at him, her eyes full of pain, like she was reliving something she couldn't outrun. "My father was investigating something they didn't want anyone to find out. It's why they made him disappear. The baby is part of that. It's why I had to keep it hidden." She paused, the words hanging heavy in the air between them. "I don't know who's after it, but I know it's not just a child. It's a symbol of everything my father was fighting for, and I'm the one who has to protect it." The room felt colder then, the weight of her past pressing down on him like a storm that wasn't just about the weather outside. She looked at him, her gaze unwavering. "I can't let them take it," she said, her voice firm now, as though she had made a decision she couldn't go back from. "I can't let them take what's left of him." The cowboy didn't know what to say. The past was too big, too heavy for him to fix, but he understood now. He understood why she was holding on to the baby, why she was willing to carry this burden alone. The weight of her past wasn't just hers. It was his too now. They were both trapped in a story that had no end in sight. He stepped closer, but she didn't move, her eyes still locked on him, her jaw set in quiet determination. He could see it now, the scars of her past etched deep into her. "What do we do now?" he asked, the question almost too much to ask. But she didn't answer. Instead, she looked down at the baby in her arms and whispered, We survive. And in that moment, he knew they were both fighting to survive, fighting against a past that wouldn't let go and a future that seemed impossible to reach. The knock came just as the sun dipped behind the hills, casting the cabin in shadow. It was sharp, deliberate, like the sound of a man who knew his presence would demand attention. The woman stiffened, her hand frozen on the doorframe, her breath catching in her chest. The cowboy didn't need to ask who it was. He knew. He'd heard the stories, seen the way the town looked at the sheriff, how they avoided his eyes and crossed the street when they saw him coming. He felt the tension rise in the room, thick and suffocating. The woman didn't move. She just stood there, her eyes wide, her lips pressed together tightly. He could see the fear in her, see how her whole body seemed to shrink at the thought of him crossing that threshold. The cowboy stood up from his chair, his boots heavy on the floor. He didn't need to ask if she wanted him to answer the door. She wouldn't. She couldn't. Her past had already put her in a cage, and the sheriff was the one who held the key. The cowboy reached the door before she could speak, his hand resting on the doorknob for a moment, steadying himself. Then he opened it. The sheriff stood on the other side, his presence filling the doorway like the weight of the whole town behind him. The man was taller than most, his shoulders broad, and the badge on his chest gleamed in the dying light. His face was unreadable, but there was no mistaking the authority in his eyes. "Evening," the sheriff said, his voice low, calm, like this was just another stop on his rounds. But the cowboy could hear the undertone, the way the words were carefully measured, like he already knew the answer to whatever he was about to ask. "Evening," the cowboy replied, standing in the doorway, blocking the entrance just enough to make it clear he wasn't inviting the man inside. "You got business here?" The sheriff's eyes flicked past him, landing on the woman who still stood frozen by the stove. He didn't say anything, just let his gaze linger on her for a moment too long. The air between them grew heavier. "I'm looking for something," the sheriff said, his tone turning colder. "I was hoping you might be able to help me find it." The cowboy didn't flinch. He didn't move. "What's it you're looking for?" he asked, his voice tight with restraint. The sheriff took a slow step forward, and the cowboy instinctively shifted his weight, just enough to show he wasn't about to step aside. "I'm looking for a missing person," the sheriff said, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Ain't nobody been missing here," the cowboy answered, his voice flat, trying to keep the tension from seeping into his words. The sheriff didn't buy it. He stepped forward again, just enough to press the issue. "Are you sure about that?" His eyes flicked once more to the woman, and this time, he didn't look away. The cowboy could see the shift in the woman's face, the way her breath hitched, the way her shoulders tightened as if she wanted to shrink into the walls. The sheriff knew, or at least, he was starting to suspect. "Ain't nobody here but us," the cowboy said, his voice low, his jaw clenched. "Well," the sheriff said, finally stepping back, his eyes still locked on the woman, "I guess I'll just have to take your word for it." The woman didn't look at either of them, her eyes focused on the stove, her hands trembling slightly as she reached for the kettle. But the cowboy saw it, the subtle way her chest rose and fell, the tightness in her throat. She was fighting to keep herself together, and he knew, deep down, that it wasn't just fear of the sheriff. It was the weight of everything she had kept buried, everything she was running from. The sheriff lingered, in the doorway for a moment longer, like he was waiting for something to break. Then, finally, he turned to leave, his boots scraping against the dirt as he stepped away from the cabin. "You let me know if you hear anything," he said, his voice softer now, but there was still a bite to it. "I'll be around." The cowboy nodded, not trusting himself to speak. He watched as the sheriff walked away, his figure disappearing into the shadows, and for a moment, everything felt too quiet. The air seemed to crackle with the tension that had just been released. The woman still hadn't moved. She was standing by the stove, her back to him, but he could see her shoulders shaking. She was holding it all in, her fear, her regret, and whatever else she was carrying that he didn't understand. He stepped toward her, his boots soft against the wood, his hand reaching out to her, but she flinched at the contact. "He didn't find anything," he said, his voice calm, trying to soothe her, trying to make it okay. But it wasn't okay, and she knew it. "He knows something," she whispered, her voice breaking. "He's been asking around. I can feel it. He's getting closer." The cowboy stepped back, giving her space. "You don't have to do this alone," he said, his voice softer now, like a promise. She shook her head, but it was more to herself than to him. "You don't know what it's like," she said, her voice trembling. "You don't know what I've done." He didn't answer right away. He didn't know what she had done or why she was so afraid, but he knew one thing. The sheriff wasn't done. And neither was the past that hung over them like a storm waiting to break. The weight of it all, the secrets, the fear, was too much to ignore. The woman turned to him then, her eyes full of something deeper than fear. It was regret. "I didn't want this," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't want any of this." The cowboy didn't say anything. He didn't need to. He knew she wasn't just talking about the sheriff. She was talking about everything. The life she had left behind. The life she couldn't outrun. The night was quieter than it should have been. The wind had stopped, and all that remained was the steady hum of the dark, empty air. The cowboy sat by the window, staring out at the black horizon, waiting. He could feel it. Something had shifted. The silence in the cabin wasn't right. It wasn't the usual stillness of the evening. It was thicker, like something was about to happen. He heard the creak of the door, barely noticeable, and his pulse quickened. She was leaving. He didn't need to think twice. He grabbed his coat and slipped out the back door, moving silently into the night. The moon was barely visible, casting the world in a dim, haunting glow. She was ahead of him, just a shadow against the darkness. He couldn't make out her features, but he knew it was her. He'd seen the way. She moved when she thought no one was watching. It was different, intentional. He followed at a distance, not wanting to alert her to his presence. She was heading toward the trees, moving swiftly and with purpose. Her pace quickened, as though she had a destination in mind. His curiosity gnawed at him. What was she hiding? Where was she going? The air felt colder now, like it was holding its breath, waiting for something to come. The trees stood like sentinels, their branches twisting in the windless night, casting long, jagged shadows across the ground. He kept his distance, but she wasn't making it easy. Her movements were quick, sharp, almost too deliberate. He could tell she was trying to cover her tracks, to hide whatever it was she didn't want him to see. He pressed on, keeping to the shadows, watching her every move. She wasn't going toward the town. No, this was different. She was headed deeper into the woods, away from the familiar, into the unknown. The cowboy's mind raced. What could she be doing? What place was so hidden, so secret, that she had to sneak away in the dead of night? He quickened his pace, stepping lightly over the uneven ground, trying to stay just out of her line of sight. The shadows played tricks on him, stretching and warping in the faint moonlight. But he didn't slow down. He had to know. He had to find out what she was hiding. The trees thinned as she neared the edge of a small clearing. He paused, pressing himself against the trunk of a nearby oak, watching. She stopped in the center of the clearing, her body still and tense, like she was listening for something. The cowboy held his breath, waiting. There was nothing but the rustle of the leaves in the wind, the quiet crunch of the earth beneath her feet. Then, something else. A flicker of movement, something else in the shadows. He squinted, trying to make sense of it, but it was too dark. She moved again, closer now, and he realized she was reaching for something, something hidden in the earth. His heart skipped. What was she digging for? The ground was soft, freshly disturbed. She had been here before. She knew exactly where to go. He moved closer, careful not to make a sound, his boots light on the damp earth. His curiosity was killing him. She was crouched down now, her hands working quickly as she pulled something from the ground, a small, weathered box. His breath caught in his throat. What was in the box? What was she keeping from him? She held it for a moment, turning it over in her hands, then closed it tightly and stood up. The cowboy took a step forward, his foot catching a branch, and it snapped loudly under his weight. Her head snapped up, her eyes wide, fear flashing in them. For a moment, they just stood there, locked in the silence of the night. He saw her hesitation, the brief moment of panic that flickered across her face before she forced it away. She wasn't surprised. She knew he would follow. "What are you doing?" His voice was low, but it carried across the quiet clearing. She didn't answer right away. She just looked at him, the weight of the moment settling between them. The box in her hands seemed heavier now, like it was carrying something too dangerous to reveal. I didn't want you to see this, she said finally, her voice thick with something unspoken. She didn't look at him. Her gaze was fixed on the box, her fingers curling around it tightly, as though it might slip away if she let go. What's in it? He asked, his voice barely a whisper. She looked at him then, her eyes tired and filled with regret. You don't want to know. I don't want to know, he repeated, his voice hardening. I've been following you through the woods at night, watching you keep secrets from me. You think I don't want to know? She swallowed, taking a shaky breath. She wasn't ready to answer. He could see it in the way her shoulders tensed, the way her hand clutched the box. You're already too far in, she said quietly, her voice distant. You can't unsee what you've already seen. He stepped forward, closing the distance between them. He wasn't going to let her turn away this time. I'm already here, he said, his voice low but firm. I'm not leaving until you tell me what this is. She took a step back, but her eyes stayed locked on his. This was never supposed to be your fight, she whispered, almost to herself. I was trying to protect you. He didn't move. He didn't look away. Protect me from what? He asked, his words slow and deliberate. She looked at the box in her hands one last time, then back at him. From the truth, she said, the words heavy with the weight of everything she had kept hidden. The clearing seemed darker now, as though the shadows had grown deeper, swallowing them whole. He waited, but she didn't speak again. The truth was buried in that box, buried in the earth, and he knew it wasn't just about the baby. It was about everything, everything that had brought them here, everything they had tried to run from. And now there was no turning back. The cowboy stood at the edge of the property, looking out at the dark patch of earth that had drawn his attention all day. The well was old, older than the cabin, older than anything around it. The stones were cracked and worn, the wood covering the top weathered and splintered. It had been abandoned for years, but something about it seemed to call out to him. He stepped forward, his boots crunching against the dry ground, and crouched by the well. The wood was rotting, but the structure was still intact, barely. He ran his hand along the stones, the surface rough and cold under his touch. The wind picked up, carrying the faintest hint of moisture in the air, like it was trying to warn him. He hesitated. Something felt wrong. He turned to look at the woman who had followed him outside but stayed at the edge of the field. She wasn't moving, just standing there, her face pale in the dim light of the setting sun. Her arms were crossed tightly, and her gaze was fixed on the well, like it was a memory she couldn't shake. What's this? He asked, his voice low, his eyes never leaving the well. She didn't answer right away. Her body was rigid, every muscle tense, and he saw her jaw tighten as she fought to keep herself together. She'd been through too much already, but he could see this place was different. It had a history, a weight she wasn't ready to share. The well, she said, her voice thick with something he couldn't place. She took a step closer, but her feet were slow, hesitant, like she wasn't sure if she wanted to be here. It's been here for generations, she continued, her eyes flicking to the ground. People used to disappear around it. The words hung in the air between them, thick and heavy. She spoke to them like they were a warning, but it was too late for that now. He had already seen it. He had already sensed the gravity of the place. Disappear? He repeated, his brow furrowing. What do you mean? Her eyes flashed with fear, a look so raw and unguarded that it sent a chill down his spine. People didn't leave, she said, her voice low, almost inaudible. They went in. And they didn't come out. The air seemed to thicken around them, the weight of her words settling into the ground beneath his feet. He turned his head slowly to look at her, the pieces of the puzzle falling into place. You've been here before, haven't you? He asked. She flinched at the question, and for a moment he thought she might run. But she didn't. She just stood there, her eyes locked on the well, her breath shallow, as though the memories of what had happened here were too much to bear. I didn't want to, she whispered, her voice barely audible. I didn't want to remember. The cowboy stood, walking slowly toward her, his steps cautious, deliberate. He could feel the tension in her body, the way she fought to keep herself composed, but he could see the cracks in her facade. She was afraid of something that had been buried here, deep in the earth. He reached out, his hand gently brushing her arm. What happened? He asked, his voice softer now. She didn't pull away, but she didn't speak either. She just stared at the well, her gaze distant, like she was seeing something he couldn't. "You don't have to tell me," he said, stepping back slightly. "But this place, it's tied to you, isn't it?" She nodded slowly, her eyes dark, full of memories that she wasn't ready to share. "It's where it all started," she said quietly. "The disappearances, the lies." He waited, letting her find the words. She glanced at him, her eyes filled with a mix of regret and fear. "My father was sheriff before he disappeared," she said, her voice wavering. "He knew about the well. He knew people were using it, but he couldn't stop it. He couldn't prove what was happening here." The cowboy didn't speak. He just watched her, letting the weight of her words settle. She swallowed hard, like the truth was too heavy to let out all at once. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice tense. "What was happening here?" She shook her head, her eyes glassy with unshed tears. "People used the well," she said, the words tumbling out in a rush. "They'd take people, prisoners, people who didn't fit, and they'd make them disappear. They'd throw them in, and no one would ever hear from them again." The wind shifted, sending a chill through the air. But the coldness was nothing compared to the weight of what she had just said. The cowboy felt it, the depth of the evil that had taken root here, in this small, forgotten place. He stepped forward, closer to her, and finally she looked at him, her eyes full of a pain he couldn't ignore. "My father tried to stop it," she whispered, her voice breaking, "but he couldn't. He got too close, and then he was gone too." The words hung in the air like a curse. He could see it now, the fear, the regret, the brokenness in her. She hadn't just been running from the past, she had been running from the darkness that had claimed so much of her life. "The baby," he said quietly, the pieces clicking into place. "It's connected, isn't it? It's why you're hiding it. It's why you can't let anyone find out." She didn't answer right away, but he saw the way her body stiffened, the way her eyes flicked toward the well. She didn't need to say anything. He knew the truth now. The baby was more than just a child. It was the last thread tying her to everything she was running from. The past wasn't just a memory here. It was alive, and it was waiting to drag her back into the darkness. The barn felt different now, like it was holding its breath. The shadows seemed deeper, more oppressive, as if the walls themselves were waiting for something to surface. The cowboy stood at the threshold, his boots still and heavy on the worn floorboards. His eyes scanned the barn. Nothing had changed. The old tools, the broken crates, the hay scattered across the ground. It all looked the same. But he knew better now. The air was thicker, the weight of what was buried in this place pressing against him. The past was calling, and it was here, under the very floor he stood on. He stepped deeper into the barn, his steps slow, deliberate. He wasn't sure what he was looking for, but he knew it was here. The barn had kept its secrets for long enough, and now it was time to uncover them. He crouched down near the far corner where the hay was piled higher than the rest. It looked like a place that hadn't been disturbed in years, the hay undisturbed, untouched, but his instincts told him otherwise. His fingers brushed through the dry straw, searching, digging, moving the hay aside. The smell of dust and earth filled his nose, and then he felt it, something solid beneath his hand. He froze for a moment, unsure, but his curiosity got the better of him, and he moved the hay away with urgency. It wasn't just dirt he'd found. It was a box, old, weathered, the wood cracked and worn, but it was unmistakable. His heart thudded in his chest as he pulled it free, lifting it from the ground, his fingers trembling as he ran them over the surface. There was a heavy weight to the box, like it had been buried for a long time, like it had something inside it that needed to stay hidden. He opened it slowly, the hinges creaking, and when he looked inside, the air seemed to freeze. Letters. Old, yellowed, with creases along the folds as if they had been read and reread 1,000 times. Photographs faded at the edges of faces he didn't recognize. And then, at the bottom, a badge. His breath caught in his throat as he pulled the badge from the box. It was tarnished with age, the metal worn and faded, but it was unmistakable. A sheriff's badge. His mind raced, the pieces of the puzzle clicking into place. The woman, her father, the things she had said about the town, the past she had been running from. It all fits now. The badge, the letters, the photographs, they were all linked to her father. The sheriff who had disappeared. The man who had tried to expose the truth. He sat back on his heels, the box open in front of him, the weight of what he'd found sinking in. Her father hadn't just been a sheriff. He had been part of something much darker, something that had been buried with him. He looked at the woman standing in the doorway, her face pale, her eyes wide with fear. She didn't need to say anything. Her expression told him everything. She had known this moment was coming. She had known he would find the past. "This is yours, isn't it?" he said quietly, holding up the badge. Her eyes flickered to it, and for the briefest moment he saw the past flash across her face. Her lips parted, but no words came out. She didn't have to speak. The silence between them was enough. He stood up slowly, taking the box with him, and walked over to where she stood. She didn't move. She was still, her gaze fixed on the floor. "What is all this?" he asked, his voice low. She swallowed, but her hands were shaking now. She didn't reach for the box and didn't try to take it from him. "My father was trying to stop them," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "He was trying to uncover what was really happening in that town. The disappearances, the people who went missing." Her words faltered, and she looked away, her eyes filling with unshed tears. "He couldn't do it," she whispered, "and they made sure of that." The cowboy stood still, absorbing the weight of her words. Her father had been trying to expose the truth, but the truth had been buried so deeply that even he hadn't been able to uncover it before it cost him everything. The baby, the well, the sheriff. They were all tied together in a dark knot, one that had been pulling her back, no matter how far she ran. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked, his voice quiet but full of frustration. She shook her head, her eyes wet now, tears finally spilling over. "I couldn't," she said, her voice breaking. "I couldn't let you get pulled into it. I didn't want to drag you into the mess he left behind." He stepped closer to her, his hand reaching out but stopping just short. He didn't want to push her. He didn't want to force her into something she wasn't ready to say. But the truth was coming, whether they were ready for it or not. "You're not alone in this," he said quietly. "I'm not going anywhere." She finally looked up at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and something else, something she had been holding back for too long. She reached out, her fingers brushing his, a touch so light it was almost fragile. "You don't know what you're getting into," she whispered. But he could see it then, the weight of the past in her eyes, and for the first time, he understood just how far her history stretched, how deep the shadows went. The puzzle was almost complete, but it wasn't over. Not yet. The weight of what was coming, the truth, the secrets, was too heavy to ignore, and neither of them could escape it. Not now. The knock came again, louder this time, insistent. The cowboy heard it before the woman did, and he was already at the door before she moved, before she even looked up from the table where she was trying, unsuccessfully, to steady her hands. Her body was rigid, her back to him as she watched the fire flicker in the stove. He stepped into the entryway, hand hovering over the doorknob. "It's him," he said quietly. She didn't answer, but her eyes flicked toward him, and for a split second, the fear was evident. It was the sheriff. And this time, there was no avoiding him. The cowboy opened the door slowly, not giving the sheriff any reason to believe he was welcome. The man stood there, tall and broad, his shadow stretching across the porch like a dark omen. The badge on his chest gleamed in the late afternoon light, but it was the look in his eyes that caught the cowboy's attention, the cold, calculating gaze that made it clear this wasn't just a friendly visit. "We need to talk," the sheriff said, his voice low, commanding. The cowboy didn't step aside. "You're not welcome here," he said, his voice sharp. The sheriff's gaze didn't shift. "This is bigger than your personal feelings." The cowboy hesitated, but the silence in the cabin behind him pushed him to act. He stepped aside, just enough to let the sheriff in, and the man moved past him, his boots thudding against the wood as if he owned the place. He didn't look at the woman, but she could feel his presence in the room, like the air had shifted with his arrival. "What's this about?" the cowboy asked, his voice low, barely more than a murmur. The sheriff didn't answer right away. He walked to the center of the room and turned, eyes landing on the woman, who still hadn't moved from the stove. "You know why I'm here," he said, his tone flat, unyielding. She didn't look at him. She kept her focus on the fire, her shoulders slumped, the weight of something too heavy to carry weighing her down. The sheriff's eyes narrowed. "The baby," he said, the word hanging in the air like a threat. The cowboy felt the tension spike, the weight of it pressing on his chest. He knew what the sheriff was implying, but he also knew that the woman wasn't going to break, not yet. She was stubborn like that. "I don't know what you're talking about," the cowboy said, stepping between the sheriff and the woman. But the sheriff didn't flinch. "You've been hiding something," he said, "and you've been doing it for far too long." The woman's back straightened, her eyes flicking toward the cowboy for the briefest moment before they returned to the fire. She didn't speak. "We both know the truth," the sheriff continued. "I'm not here to play games. I'm here for what's mine." The cowboy didn't like the way the sheriff said that. It wasn't a demand. It was a claim, like the baby was some kind of possession, something the sheriff had every right to take. "You're not taking anything," the cowboy said, his voice low and steady. The sheriff's eyes shifted, landing on the cowboy, and for a moment the tension between them thickened. "We'll see about that," the sheriff said, his gaze flickering to the woman once again. She didn't meet his eyes. "You can't run forever," he said, his voice softer now, like he was trying to get under her skin. "You can't keep hiding it." The room felt smaller, the weight of the past settling over them like a shroud. She still didn't speak, but the energy in the room shifted. The truth was here, just under the surface, waiting to break free. The woman turned slowly, her eyes tired but resolute. She looked directly at the sheriff, but there was no fear in her gaze, only the quiet acceptance of what she knew was coming. "It's mine," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. The sheriff's eyes widened, and the silence between them was deafening. The cowboy looked between them, confused. "What the hell is she talking about?" he asked, his voice low. The woman didn't look at him. She didn't look away from the sheriff. "It's my responsibility," she continued, her voice steady now. "My father's too. He couldn't protect it, and neither can you." The sheriff stepped forward, his face hardening. "You don't get to make the rules here," he snapped. "That baby is coming with me." The woman shook her head slowly. "No," she said. "It's too late for that." The sheriff's face tightened, his jaw clenched. The air in the cabin grew thick, the tension crackling with the weight of unspoken history. "You've been hiding it for far too long," the sheriff muttered. "You've been running, thinking you could keep this thing from me." But the woman didn't flinch. She stood her ground, her eyes never leaving his. "There's no running from what's buried here," she said, her voice low but full of something sharp. "The truth is already out. It's always been here." The sheriff's gaze flickered to the cowboy for a moment, his eyes hard with frustration. He took a deep breath and turned back to the woman. "This isn't over," he said, his voice cold. "You can't hide forever." The words hung in the air like a warning. The cowboy watched as the sheriff turned and walked out the door, his boots echoing in the stillness. The woman didn't move. She didn't say a word. But the weight of everything she had kept hidden, everything they had tried to outrun, was finally out in the open. The reckoning had come, and it had left them both standing in the shadow of a past they could never escape.